Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBD Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we're almost done through the first round. We've gotten a bunch of big matchups that have come through since the last time we recorded, and we're going to talk about them right now. I think the first one we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about Lakers-Wolves, I think. So we had a couple of games that went through since the last time we recorded, and we had game, I believe, 3 and 4, right? Game 3, that was a big game that the Wolves ended up winning, 116-104. The big difference there was Luka came into the game under the weather, stomach bug, apparently was throwing up, still ended up playing 40 minutes, but just wasn't himself. And if you watch the Lakers offensively for a decent chunk of the game, they did have a lead at different points. And despite Luka kind of being under the weather, they were in this game. But then you look around and you had the 16 turnovers, and then just a bunch of just bungled possessions in terms of rebounding. And that kind of was the key to the Wolves being able to close it out. And Anthony Edwards was the story in that one, along with Jaden McDaniels scoring 30 points, Julius Randle chipping in with 22, even Naz Reid and DiVincenzo in double figures. And it felt like after that game, it felt like the Lakers were in trouble because you thought you got a great LeBron game. He had 38 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals, 2 blocks. He shot the ball well from 3, made a bunch of big defensive plays, and you just felt like you kind of wasted a LeBron game, and that's not a position you really want to be in. And, when you get to game 4, it was kind of a little more the same, but the difference was the Lakers actually had a bigger cushion going into the fourth quarter. I believe they were up 10 to begin the fourth quarter. And then, again, Ant took over the game. The role players for the Wolves also hit some big shots. And the Lakers offense just continued to bog down right over the course of the second half. And that's kind of been the big key for the Wolves in this series going up 3-1 is, we talked about from the perspective of if the Lakers were to win the series, it was going to be on the backs of their 3 main guys playing well together offensively, and then the role players showing up and finding ways, to kind of combat the Wolves' bigger lineups by maybe getting some boards, getting some stops, limiting maybe guys like Gobert and others. And that was really not the case, right? It's funny because when you look at the Lakers throughout this series, it's funny because the defense, you could argue, probably, even though they did get out rebounded at different points, right? The defense you probably felt like at times was okay, but the offense kind of feels like the biggest story where the offense just was not, I think, what we were kind of looking for from the Lakers' perspective. Even in game 4, you got 38 from Luka, right, who looked a lot better, coming off of his illness, and you got 27 and 12 and 8 from LeBron, but Luka only had 2 assists, and it just felt like in the second half, especially that fourth quarter, they just couldn't get anything going offensively. And then you also had the fact that you didn't really get anything from any of your role players. Even in that game, I believe the only guy off the bench that scored was Dorian Finney-Smith, and he played 40 minutes. Jackson Hayes played 4 minutes in this game. Him being unplayable pretty much is kind of a story because that means you're going the vast majority of this series with no center. And it's just kind of tough to do that against the big physical team. The Lakers, not just the 2 stars, but their whole 5 guys, right? Like their 5 best players all played like the entire second half. I don't think they came out at all. LeBron played 46 minutes. Luka played 46 minutes. You got 41 minutes from Rui, 40 minutes from Dorian Finney-Smith, who came off the bench. Austin Reeves played 35 because he was in foul trouble. And, you just got really nothing from any of those guys. So for the Wolves, the big difference in the series is the role players. Of course, Ant was awesome, right? And that's kind of a big key, for them in this one. He had 43 and 9 and 6, right? And then the fourth quarter, that's kind of where he was doing a lot of his biggest damage because he was kind of able to make some big shots, spread the ball around, get guys good looks, compared to what you saw the Lakers offensively, and they couldn't do that. Randall also had a great series, so that was a big difference because we didn't know what we were going to get from him because, everybody had talked about he had historically not been a great postseason guy, but we also knew that he's actually played pretty well against LA for, since he's left, LA, right? Because he used to be a Laker.
Mm-hmm.
And they just got a few extra guys that came along for the ride. So kind of a tough spot to be in if you're LA. I think you also look at Austin Reeves. He didn't have a great series, right? And I think that was kind of another key for the Lakers because you got probably enough offensively from guys like Luka and LeBron. I mean, Luka wasn't great in Game 3, but you give him a pass because he was sick. But just as a whole, it just felt like it was kind of a letdown for him, right? Because it felt like the physicality, the length might have been a little bit much. He was 6 for 14 and 5 of 12 from three, but you just felt like you left kind of hoping to get a little more out of him. And then obviously the other role players, like you got very little from Gabe Vincent, pretty much nothing from Vanderbilt, other than fouls. And then Jordan Goodwin was out there, but like, it's kind of hard to ask him to do a whole lot because he's such a limited offensive player. So now, if you're the Lakers, you're down 3-1 in the series. It's pretty much over. And it's funny, right? Because they were by and large favored to win the series because of the top end talent. But then when you watch the series, like the top end talent played relatively fine, but then when you go down the list, you just didn't get enough from the supporting cast, and that's kind of the difference. Like you got for the Wolves, you got 2 30-point Jaden McDaniels games, which, that's a lot for him, right? He's not usually a guy that gives you close to 30 points in a game. He's usually kind of in the mid lower teens. Of course, we've seen him have big playoff games before, but this one was different because it wasn't like it was a magnet ball, he's just hitting a bunch of jumpers type game. It was a lot of him getting to the rim, finishing through traffic, getting offensive rebounds. He only had one in this game, but in some of the other games he got, extra opportunities. And that was kind of the key. And, for the Wolves, like that was kind of the argument for people who picked them to win the series, why they thought they would win. They thought that they were bigger, athletic, more deep. And that's also kind of, the issue as well. Like, because they had guys that played over 40 minutes, but you also got just enough from some of these other guys where you're just not getting that from LA. And we kind of talked about after the deadline, right? Like, we thought, like, okay, maybe if things break their way, they could make a run. But one of the reasons why we didn't say pick them to win the West, and maybe we wouldn't have picked them to win multiple rounds. I mean, this was kind of the more favorable bracket because you're not playing Oklahoma City, but you knew there was going to be an issue of you have one center, and we don't know what to expect from that guy. Probably not going to be a super playable guy. Like we said, there was probably a cap on how far the Lakers could go when they didn't get a big at the deadline. I mean, of course, you can always say like, well, we can get it in the summer. Of course, then you can but you also have to look at it as like LeBron's 40. How many great years does he have left? You're probably still going to have to move around guys on the roster again. I mean, I don't think you're going to probably get it big for the mid level. You probably would have to trade some guys. But, this was always kind of the tough reality for the Lakers this season where they weren't going to win the title, but I think you at least would have hoped that they could that they could get out of the first round, especially as the higher seed. But that's part of what makes the Western Conference so tough. And, when you look at the Wolves, I think a lot of people, ourselves included, kind of undersold them. I picked the Lakers in 6 because I thought the Wolves were still good enough where it's like, you got to take them seriously. I think they can win a few games, and I laid out a pathway for them to win the series, but the Wolves were just better. And it's funny because one of the other keys we talked about was if the Lakers played disciplined, if they played smart and kind of played how we saw them play when they were at their best, then they probably would win the series, but they weren't really able to sustain it. And, those fourth quarters were pretty rough, right? Compared to Minnesota, where everything just felt more, like more in control. And it wasn't like they played perfect either, but you just look at the Lakers and just how bad it looked at different points in the fourth. And that's just rough, right? And it's tough just because from the perspective of now, if you're the Lakers, like you're coming off the Luka trade high, and now you're going to be a first round exit again, right? Like last year, except you work to be a higher seed. But either way, there's work to be done with this roster. We don't have to get into the offseason stuff until they're eliminated. But the Wolves showed why, they need to be taken seriously and why people view them, as a, why there are people who view them as a legit contender. Now we'll see. Maybe they make it to the second round and don't look good again. Maybe the matchups that come out from the other team that they're going to play against, maybe those are tougher matchups. But it is what it is. But it's tough because you look at a lot of the games that the Lakers lost, other than Game 1. I mean, they could have easily won either of these two games, but they just weren't good enough down the stretch, and the Wolves were better.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, that's where it starts. Anthony Edwards is that guy at this point. I think it's pretty much confirmed. He had a 43-point game and super efficient, and getting everybody involved. That's the thing. Because, when the Wolves did lose the one game in this series, Anthony Edwards didn't really, get other guys involved. And he had like an okay game, scoring wise. But, that's the key. Like when all those other guys show up, like Jaden McDaniels, Julius Randle, all those guys, Naz Reid, when they show up, this team is really scary. And I definitely didn't take that into account as much as I probably should have when picking, the Lakers in 5 to win this series, because I just thought that Luka, LeBron and Austin Reeves, I thought they would all be on their A game, but it seemed like, you kind of got one on their A game and the others were kind of lagging behind. LeBron, I think he had a good game. This game, he got to the line a lot. He had 18 free throws. And then Austin Reeves, I wasn't really impressed with him. I think the Minnesota Timberwolves and what they were able to accomplish on the defensive end, kind of, siphoning him out of the game, was pretty impressive. Having Anthony Edwards kind of, being that guy to physically, you know, I guess bother him from all three levels on the floor. I really enjoyed that. And I think that was one of the keys as to why AR probably didn't pop off as much. But, the Lakers, they didn't really have a whole lot of rotations to go to. When I was looking at Minnesota, they were constantly rotating guys in and out. You had Nickeil Alexander-Walker, come in for certain stretches of the game. Dante DiVincenzo, just being out there, getting fresh legs. And I feel like, with the Lakers, you didn't really have that. And the lack of a big man for sure was definitely an issue because, there's certain times where not necessarily that Rudy Gobert, can punish you, but, just his presence does somewhat bother a team that is significantly smaller in height, and Naz Reid, being a versatile guy on the offensive end, and then also kind of showcasing some perimeter defensive skills somehow. I didn't even really know that he had that in his bag, but,
He does actually.
yeah, exactly. So, that was interesting to me. And I feel like the Lakers' interior defense kind of fell apart because it feels like once you get past the free throw line, when you go up against the Lakers and they don't have a big man or a rim protector there, it's pretty much a guaranteed 2 or an O board, and you get a second chance opportunity or you get to the line. And I feel like, that's where the personnel thing does kind of irk me a little bit because they just didn't have a big man to really anchor things down on either end of the floor. And I feel like you would have wanted that just a little bit, but I don't really know where the Lakers can. I don't think it's a winnable series at this point. I don't think you can rally, back from 3-1 in the first round. And what a disappointment I feel like for the Lakers. But for the Timberwolves, you have to, give them a round of applause because we talked about it, going into the series for the X factors with both these teams. It was going to be, who's going to be the third options, who's going to show up. And Jaden McDaniels showed up because that guy is not really known as an offensive guy. And in the regular season, he's pretty much a non-existent on their offense. But for some reason in the postseason, the past couple of years, he's been the guy to pretty much get them out of the first round along with Anthony Edwards, which is really, really special.
Yeah, it feels like if you're the Lakers, like obviously you give credit to the Wolves. It just felt like there were some blown opportunities, right? There were possessions, especially in I think it was game 3, right? That was the game where you had multiple possessions where like a guy dribbles the ball off his foot or like, a guy gets the rebound, then loses it and then fouls and gives up an and one. Just like a lot of just boneheaded plays. And part of that is again the Wolves defense, I think, kind of speeding up some of what those guys want to do, and then some of it's just kind of dummy mistakes. But and then I think that's the other cases, like say for like a guy like a JJ Redick, like rookie head coach, never coached before, and it did kind of feel like that. It showed that showed right late in the game when it just didn't feel like hey, you got to find some better ways to execute your offense than kind of just mismatch hunting opportunities where it just wasn't effective.
Yeah.
Right, like they were trying to kind of do mismatches, and it wasn't really working. And it felt like the ones that maybe you could try to go to, they didn't do a whole lot of. Like you didn't see a lot of guys say posting up like a Mike Conley or like a Nickeil Alexander. You just didn't see a lot of that. And it's the stuff on the margins. In a close series is kind of disappointing from that perspective. Again, the Wolves won this series, but the Lakers also did, I think, do a lot to lose it. But at the end of the day, this was kind of why, as a Laker fan, I didn't really look at this as like, thank goodness we got Minnesota and not Golden State. Not because I didn't think that they were going to lose to Golden State, but just it wasn't an easy matchup, right? In the Western Conference, there are no easy matchups unless I guess you're matching up against the Houston Rockets. But just as a whole, I mean, it's just kind of, you just kind of look at it and McDaniels is kind of the difference maker because he outplayed Austin Reeves in this series pretty significantly,
Oh yeah.
and if that happens, that's it's not the only reason because these games were still close. But you just felt like if you got like close to what you would getting from regular season Austin, like I mean, I don't want to like make it seem like oh yeah they'd be up 3-1 and not Minnesota. Just I think it'd be a better. I think it would. I don't think the Wolves would be automatically up 3-1. Or if
I
you
agree.
just got like, or if you got like a couple of, or just to make up for like a couple of role players, giving you something offensively. Like Gabe Vincent was pretty quiet, and like I said, we were kind of trying to figure out can Vanderbilt play in this series? Could Jackson Hayes play in this series? I think we thought that Hayes could play. I think we
If
were mixed
Gobert was
on
out there.
Vanderbilt. Yeah, Gobert. Yeah, I think we were kind of mixed as to whether or not Jared Vanderbilt could play.
Hmm.
I think you're kind of thinking like maybe you could put him on Ant, something like that. And like he had like a couple of moments like in terms of rebounding, but he was kind of useless, I'd say for
Unplayable.
oh, yeah, yeah, and that's the tough part is that they had multiple guys that they kind of rely on a decent amount that were unplayable.
Yeah.
And that's and to have that in the first round is pretty difficult because like you might expect that like maybe in later rounds or maybe towards the end of the series like when teams start making adjustments, right? Like we know them when the Lakers were in the conference finals a couple years ago, right? Like they had guys who played early on in the first round, didn't see him as much as things went on, right? Like Malik Beasley played, or like Troy Brown Jr. played, or like Wenyen Gabriel played, and like you didn't see those guys as the series went on, right? And even a guy like Vanderbilt, he started, but then played a lot less as the series went on, stuff like that. But Minnesota's got 8 guys, right? Like they have their starting five. Then you got some combo of like DiVincenzo, Naz Reid, Nikhil Alexander Walker. Even what was it? Terrence Shannon Jr. got like a
Yeah.
few minutes,
He
but
gets
like,
spot minutes.
but
Yeah.
yeah, but like they have. It feels like 8 guys, and all you need is like I don't know 4 or 5 of those guys to be good, and then like maybe a couple, and then you get like a little bit of like 2 other guys could show up in different games.
Yeah.
But and that's kind of the difference, right? So like that, and that's what makes the supporting cast so important because we're in an era now where a lot of these teams are closer in terms of like the seeds, right? Like, I mean, yeah, the Lakers were 3 and Minnesota was 6, but they were separated by a game.
Hmm.
But, the thing is that you kind of view this as okay, the Lakers have 2 of the 3 best players, right? Whereas, the Wolves have like, one of the 3, and then you don't know what to do with Randall. Clearly, he was one of the best in this series,
Hmm.
but like you're looking at that and then you're just kind of thinking like, okay, like in the past, that logic you would think would win you the series. But if as what we've seen from the postseason so far, not always the case, right? Like some of the other series is a little bit different. We'll see what happens with the Bucks and the Nuggets Clippers one, and we'll talk about those as we go along. But yeah, just didn't go the way you would have wanted to if you're the Lakers. But, again, we talked about it with the Luka trade. Like, even though we felt like maybe they could make a deep run, I don't think we thought they were getting to the finals, right?
Yeah.
But I think we thought definitely conference finals. Like, this is definitely a disappointment, I would say, for sure, right? Like a first round exit, no matter how you slice it, is pretty disappointing. Like last year was disappointing, but at least you say, like, well, they were the 7 seed. So it's like, you
Hmm.
probably weren't beating Denver in the first round
Hmm.
anyways, right? But this one, you're the higher seed, and that just feels like a major disappointment because most people picked them to win the series. But that's why it kind of felt concerning after game one because, game one, obviously, you never overreact after one game, but it just kind of felt like it felt a little alarming seeing like the struggles that LA was having offensively based off of I think what we expected to see, and it kind of continued over the course of the series, even as the games were more competitive. It just and that was kind of the key there. Like I think defensively and on the boards, maybe it wasn't great, but I think the offense was the bigger issue
Yeah.
in this series. You know what I mean? Like, and it sucks because the last 2 games you got decent jump shooting games from the team. Like they shot 40% from 3 in game 4,
Hmm.
and then they shot 42% from 3 in game 3, right?
Right.
And then, from the field, 45, which is not amazing, but 47 also in game 3. So it's just disappointing. It felt like if they had had like 1 or 2 more guys show up, that could have probably, like I said, changed it. But, you didn't get that.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, I'm looking at a guy like Rui. maybe it's
Hmm.
not really his fault because a lot of stuff isn't really drawn up for him. And in this game, I think Minnesota was more, I guess, lenient in terms of giving him open looks.
Right.
But I feel like he's a guy that needs to be a little bit more involved if he's going to be a starter because I know
Hmm.
defense isn't his strongest characteristic. So let's get him involved offensively. That's where I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that. And then the
His
bench guys,
defense.
I don't know, but his defense is good. Like, don't get me wrong,
Yeah, I
it's
thought his
improved
defense.
because he used to be a
Yeah.
cone in Washington, but in LA he's been pretty solid, and I feel like he matches up well defensively with a lot of the guys in Minnesota because he matches that length and what they have over there. But I mean, offensively, I don't really know what to make of this team. It was very
Yeah.
different from what we saw in the regular season. Far less balanced, far less
Yeah.
in rhythm.
Yeah, and it's funny because we saw since the Luka trade, there was a long stretch when they were winning games, but it was really on the backs of their defense. It wasn't really their offense, because they had the stretch where they were the number one defense in the
Mm-hmm.
league, but they were kind of like middle of the pack offensively, and a lot has been made about the lack of organized offense. Again, you're not going to get organized offense every possession, right? Because you have guys that are at the best with that are at their best with the ball in their hands.
Mm-hmm.
But it just felt like you left a lot on the table. And even a guy like Rui showed up in this game, but he was kind of disappointing, I think, in the earlier games in
Yeah.
the series because you're kind of looking around and you're like, hey, where's the 20-point game from Rui? Like,
Right.
we saw in the regular season, where's like a 15-point game from Gabe Vincent, or maybe like a 4 or 5 3-point game from Dorian Finney-Smith,
Yeah.
right? And that's just kind of, I think, the part. Like you said, you look at the Wolves, two 30-point Jaden McDaniels games. Randall was consistently good. Edwards was consistently good. And this was with Gobert being like mostly a negative at times mainly on the offensive end. Like he
Yeah.
was a minus 11 and then in game, I think it was game 4,
Yeah.
right? Or no, game 3.
No, he's
And
in
then
the
in
minus
game
11 in Game 4 as well.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
All right. It looks like it said +3, but
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Yeah, but wait, no, that was game 3. In game 3, he was +3, and then in game 4, he was
Minus 11.
minus 11.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my point. So like that's the part that's like with Gobert not hurting you a ton in terms of I mean I guess he was quote unquote better in this game on the boards and he was out there for 26 minutes, but most of that was again the other guys like Nas Reed was great, and Randall and McDaniels. You didn't really have much from Gobert, at least offensively, which you don't expect anyways. But you didn't lose the series because of Gobert. I mean, yeah, he hurt them on some switches, but it just felt like they made a lot of stupid mistakes. But again, the Wolves were better. And they made the argument in the case for like, yeah, we should have been probably favored to win the series, even though we were the lower seed, because they were playing really good the latter part of the season as well. Now, their schedule was easier, but you saw for most of the latter part of the season, they were top 10 on both ends of the floor. And it seems like they figured out a lot of their issues from earlier in the season. And they're not completely wed to like, we have to play Gobert and close with him. Like,
Right.
it was like in previous seasons. Like, if he stinks, you put out Nas Reed. If Conley stinks, you put out DiVincenzo, right? Like,
Yep.
and then if someone else stinks, maybe Nikhil Alexander Walker comes in. And again, that depth is the key there.
Yeah. Next man up.
Yeah. Then we move on. We had a couple other games that occurred. We did have a series that ended. We had the Oklahoma City Thunder eliminating the Memphis Grizzlies 117-115, right? And the Thunder ended up winning 4-zip. And this was one that was not shocking or surprising. We expected this to be a 4 or 5 game series. And then obviously once Ja went down, figured it would end even quicker. I mean, the last 2 games were closer. I mean, because Morant got hurt. The Grizzlies were up like 30 in the first half. And then the Thunder came back and ended up stealing the game. Then in game 4, it was pretty back and forth the whole way. And then OKC closed it out. You expected a couple of closer games. But, again, not a whole lot to take away from the series. I think the main thing is if you're OKC, you had a professional mindset going in. You didn't really screw around. You didn't really waste a lot of possessions. You didn't do any stupid stuff. You went in and you looked at this team and said, we should beat this team. We're better. Let's end it quickly. And now we kind of get to chill and wait, for the second round matchup, that's at least going to be going at least 6 with the Clippers Nuggets one. SGA was great in game 4, right? Didn't have to do a ton offensively for most of the series, but I mean, that's because OKC is a lot better. But I think Chet Holmgren was the big story in this series. Didn't do as much in game 4, but the fact that you see a lot of growth from him offensively, where he's knocking down threes, he's able to attack closeouts and put the ball on the floor, and he's finding ways to make that two big man lineup work with Hartenstein. I think that's kind of an interesting wrinkle to what we've seen. And then
Yes, sir.
obviously the bench guys, Wiggins, Wallace, Caruso especially, right? He was the guy that they kind of trusted to guard Jaren Jackson Jr. for a lot of the series, funny enough.
Hmm.
But I think that's kind of the main thing was like you saw most of what you wanted to see from the Thunder, right? Like you knew they were going to win the series. You knew it was going to be quick. You just kind of were thinking like, how does it look against, like a decent basketball team? And then, whether or not do they get it done quickly or do they screw around? And I think, that's a good sign, I think, from OKC, right? Because like even in game 3, they could have easily said, we're down 30 in this game. We're on the road. It's not our night. Obviously, Ja got hurt, so that's a big difference. But still, like they took that one seriously and they came back. So big positives there, I think, if you're Oklahoma City. Now, like I said, you just wait.
Yeah, I mean, it's a first round matchup in there, the number 1 seed, and Memphis is number 8. So, I know a lot of people don't really care about this series, but I think it means a lot because these are kind of, reps that Oklahoma City, needs. And it's like, it's great for them because, like you talked about, now we're seeing, Chet find his true role because he was out the majority of the season and they still won all these games, without him.
Yep.
So, him finding his role in the playoffs is going to be crucial. J Dub showing up and being Mr. Consistent, offensively. I think that helps. That'll be a confidence booster for him because I think he probably has the most doubters out of everybody on the squad. We already know that SGA is going to get his. Didn't really do it throughout the series, but, in this game, pretty much put the game away. And yeah, they have the depth, to be the best team in the Western Conference. And I think that's why we do both have them coming out of the West because they have the depth. Their guys are, starting to find that rhythm like we thought that they would. And, come to the next round, I think, it might be more challenging than this, but I still think they're going to get, out of the West for sure.
I mean, and that's the big thing is the depth as well, the
Yeah.
depth and the defense. I mean, how many guys are they usually playing in these games? I mean, they got, you pretty much have the starting
Eight
five,
to
then you
10.
got some combo of Wiggins, Case and Wallace, Caruso, Isaiah Joe, and then, I mean, that's already what,
So,
8
yeah.
guys, 9 guys, and then, you factor in random sprinkling of maybe the other big Jalen Williams or Kenrich Williams. Like
Mm-hmm.
they randomly played like a minute or two
Mm-hmm.
in the game, but just as a whole, the fact that they have a bunch of guys that they can kind of just throw out there at different points, it's pretty nice because
Yeah.
you look at some of these other teams, like say the Lakers, and you look and they only really had like 5 guys for most of the series
Yeah.
that you could really kind of rely on, and a couple of them were not as good as they were in the regular season.
Yes, sir.
Whereas you look at OKC, yeah, SGA wasn't at his best this series, but I mean, one, you didn't need it because they were playing Memphis. But then you look at all the other guys and what they were able to contribute, and that's what you want to see. From a team that, again, not just us, but most people pick to come out of the Western Conference, right? So that's you pretty much saw a lot of positives. It's just again, let's see what it looks like once they move on to the next round and play, a presumably better team that could be a tougher matchup. I think we're still gonna pick OKC against one of the other teams, regardless of who comes out. But I'm very interested in seeing what it looks like against those other teams because
Mm-hmm.
it's only going to get tougher. I think from here, it's
Yeah, I
possible
agree.
the second round maybe their toughest opponent in the West. I don't know.
I agree.
We'll see. But I'm excited for that next series, whomever they play.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing, regardless who the
Yeah.
opponent is.
Yeah. Then Knicks Pistons was also a game that came on. We watched that. We're recording this on Sunday, right? So this is several hours after the game, but just as a whole, we picked the Knicks to win this series. We've been sweating buckets for most of this
Oh,
series
yeah.
because, a lot of these games have gone down to the wire. I mean, the 3 games that the Knicks won, I mean, they could have easily lost any of them. I mean, they were all like kind of, up in the air. And that came down to the last few, possessions, right? Obviously, you had the one in game 3. And then obviously you had game 4, which was even closer. And that one, it looked like the Pistons were going to win it. And, for the Knicks, again, like obviously the big story is, of course, after the game ended, the refs admitted that they blew the call where Tim Hardaway Jr. should have gotten 3 free throws.
Mm-hmm.
All he needed to do was make two, and that would have ended the game
Mhm.
out of three. Unfortunately, in the playoffs, sometimes refs can determine the outcome of a game. I
Yeah.
don't usually like to blame officiating. I didn't even mention it, say in the Lakers Wolves series. I know, people mention a lot of the tough calls, but just as a whole, for you never want it to come down to the last possession, and I think that's the tough part. But then if you look at the Pistons, look at the way once again, this is kind of one of the reasons why we picked the Knicks to win the series. Just so many possessions kind of down the stretch of games where that are just kind of tough possessions, right? Like say there was a double stretch where what was it? It was like Asor Thompson um blows a layup, right? Or a shot at the paint or a shot near the basket.
Mhm.
Then they actually get the stop, but then Asor Thompson gets the ball and then throws it away, right? Those are like two wasted possessions, and that's not the only one. But just as a whole, and that first half, it was funny because the Pistons were awful, and then they were able to, they were just turning the ball over left and right, and then they were able to get back into the game, and they were in control for
Mhm.
most of the second half, and then blew it again and again. Like I said, it's tough because you make the case of they should have been awarded the free throws and should have won the game. It's just not much you can do about it at this point. But just from a Knicks perspective, again, I think the reason why we picked the Knicks to win the series is again when the ball is spread out and you're getting multiple guys getting different opportunities offensively, right? They should win. Now this one was kind of more of a two-man game, but at the same time, unlike when they lost in game 2 where it was mostly Brunson, you got a healthy mix of Towns and Brunson together in this game at different points, right? Where both guys hit big shots to keep the Knicks in the game when they were down, and then to help them take the lead. Right, Towns had the tough fadeaway and the deep three. Right, those are huge shots from him. Brunson, of course, had what like 13 or whatever points in the fourth quarter, and that was after he came back after turning his ankle or whatever happened. So the Knicks offense, right, is kind of the reason why we picked them to win this series because even if they're down by a decent amount, they have guys that can get you back into the game because they can get you pretty reliable offense,
Yeah.
right? Whereas you look at the Pistons and, it's just you're kind of banking on, Kate Cunningham, aside from the 7 turnovers, was awesome. He had a great second half, especially the third quarter. But then you look around, Tim Hardaway Jr., 5 of 16, 4 of 13 from three. Um, you got 18 from Tobias Harris, even though he was 6 of 15. And again, you lost by 1 point, and you even had like an okay Malik Beasley shooting game, but just again, like yeah, you can blame the officiating, and that's definitely true, and that's the tough part. Like you're down 3-1 because of a bad missed call. That's horrible. But for the Knicks offensively, the way that they're able to get baskets down the stretch is the big reason why they were favored to win this series, and they won both games in Detroit. So they were able to escape Detroit, and get home court back. And now, they're going back to New York with a chance to end this series. We'll see what the Pistons do and keep it alive. We had Knicks in 6, but again, I just feel like the Knicks are the better team. So I think, it's not a shock or a surprise that they're up. But the Pistons have given them everything they could handle. And like I said, I think you make the case that they should have won this game because of the free throws. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't make them. Maybe he goes 1 for 3. It's a tie game. They lose in overtime. Maybe he goes 0 for 3 or 2 for 3 or 3 for 3. We don't know. He should have gotten the opportunity. But, I mean, it's just tough because in the playoffs, like, you just never want to come down to that situation. Because I do feel like there were possessions before that where I think the Pistons made some mistakes. And, that's how you get into the position of it's a 1 point game. And I mean, just the Knicks shot making at the end was kind of tough to overcome because it felt like the Pistons had that game, right? I
I
mean,
agree.
like just, yeah, like the shots that Towns and Brunson made to keep the Knicks afloat were just incredible. But it just, if you're the Pistons, it's rough because it feels like that game was probably your season right there.
Yeah, and with the Knicks, I do want to start with them because I feel like the Jalen Brunson, Karl Anthony Towns duo when they're on, it's amazing. I think they're one of the best in the league. At what they do because they're so efficient from all three levels. And they can get others involved. Out of what they're doing. Specifically, but in this game, like you said, it was pretty much just those two guys because the wings were awful offensively. I think Josh Hart's confidence from the 3-point line that was huge for them because they needed that big time. But overall, it was definitely more of the Karl Anthony Towns Brunson show. But
Mhm.
with Detroit, I mean, you're kind of just really kicking yourself because, like you talked about, Asor had those turnovers, but even Cade, he had 7 of them, and I think that was an issue. At times where
Yeah, he had the one late with where Hart kind of got the ball off of his leg or whatever, right?
exactly, yeah, and it's like kind of just driving into the paint, rushing things a little bit, and that's kind of one of the things that I liked about Cade. Going into the series was his ability to really kind of just play at his own speed. But in this game, I think the Knicks did a better job at speeding him up and making him feel a little rattled, somewhat. But 3-point shooting, the Detroit Pistons couldn't buy one. They were 7 for
Yeah,
29 from the 3-point line. That's gonna hurt
that's
every single
that's
time.
been the case all series.
Exactly. So, it comes down to experience. Late game stuff wasn't too happy about. But overall, I thought this game was pretty, entertaining. The entire fourth quarter, really, I would say, second half was very entertaining. I feel like it did get ruined a little bit, by the poor refereeing at the end because I think it was blatantly a foul. I think you have to call that
Yeah,
foul if you want me to be
like I
honest.
know. Yeah, because like I know that they're looking at it like he shot it kind of awkwardly, and it's like, oh, he tried to draw the foul, but he did foul him.
Yeah,
Even Josh Hart was like, you know,
he touched him, man.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
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 it was
like
clear.
you
It
got,
was clear as day.
yeah.
And
And
it's
so
unfortunate.
and that changes the series, obviously, because then it's 2-2
Mhm.
going back to New York,
Mhm.
and, then you got a real series, but 3-1, I know we always make the 3-1 jokes, but, I just think it's tough to come back
I
down
agree.
3-1 unless you're in a scenario where, like, maybe if you have home court, maybe, like, if the other team just completely goes cold, which the Knicks could. It just feels like the 2 games that the Pistons lost or the other 2 games that the Pistons lost before this one, they gave away. Like those were your chances to be up in the series, and you just didn't weren't able to take advantage. And like I said, this one is brutal because of the officiating, so nothing you can do about that. And there's been lots of complaints I think people have had about the officiating in the playoffs in a bunch of series, right? And I think part of it stems from okay, you can be more physical but you can't call everything. But because you can be more physical, there's stretches where like it's pretty obvious it's a foul, but they're not going to call it. But then there's other stretches where then they start calling touch fouls, and then that's how you get these scenarios where it's just too inconsistent. Like that's where I think most of the complaints that people have, because even with Detroit, like there were possessions where they were kind of banging the crap out of the Knicks, but at the same time, just as a whole. I think it just the officiating kind of needs to be figured out. But again, this is kind of one of the this is like the worst case scenario where you did lose a game because of a bad call ultimately. Again, you put yourself in the position to be there because of some of the turnovers and the lack of great late game offense, but just as a whole, that's been kind of the case in this series where just it kind of you felt going into the series if it's a close game chances are the Knicks are going to take it because just as a whole, they have more options. And this one was, again, like the Knicks are at their best when everybody's involved offensively. But like you said, the wings were not great, but you didn't have to have them in this one. This was a Brunson and Towns
Oh
backpack
yeah,
game
for
for the
sure.
most.
But I feel like if you're in New York, you should not feel too good, I think, with how you've performed throughout the majority of this series. Because, like you talked about, very close games and games that Detroit has pretty much handed to you, on a silver platter with their mistakes, if you want me to be honest. But I guess you could
Yeah,
also credit New York's, I guess, ability to kind of get in their head. But even then, I feel like
yeah.
that's somewhat of a cop out.
Yeah, like that by and large they're good in late game situations because they got guys that you can go to late in games. It's
Yeah.
just again it's just kind of how it goes because they'll probably they'll be facing Boston in the second round and we'll see what it looks like when they play the Celtics because that's a different team compared to Detroit. But just as a whole, either way, I think that at least the good thing is Brunson and Towns, like the 2-man game that you saw in the regular season, still looks like it's like it's working. You know what I mean? Like I
I
think
agree.
that's at least the nice thing that you're getting there. Like it still looks like a lethal combo. And I think if you have that, you can at least feel good about we have something we can go to, a decent amount in the playoffs if we need to.
Yep.
Yeah. Then moving on, couple other series. I guess let's go into Houston Golden State. This was one where the big story was Jimmy Butler not being available to play, which I think we kind of anticipated,
Hmm.
right? And I think, we talked about it before where I'm like, I think Golden State still has a chance to be able to win that game, depending on what you get from Houston offensively. And what did we get from Houston offensively? We didn't really get much. It's funny because, when you look at this series, I think the problem with Houston going in was always going to be, what are we going to get from most of the guys? Because we look at Jalen Green, and he's the key for Houston to be able to go as far as they can, potentially win the series. And you just feel like there's been a lot of inconsistency there. Now, in this game compared to game 2, Golden State clearly had the mindset to take him out of the game, make him not as much of a factor, right? Send 2 at him, force him to give it up, force him to be, play like a little bit confused and kind of have to think at different points. And he just wasn't up for it. Now, again, not completely all his fault, because you didn't get a ton of help from most of the other guys either, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of been the problem for Houston over the course of this series, where I think the tough part about picking them to win the series, I think, was you're banking on a lot of guys to play up a level, and we don't know what we're going to get from them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look around, most of the guys, I would say, have been pretty subpar, I think. And in this game, it's tough because you're like, no Jimmy Butler. How does Golden State score? How does Houston score? Like, that's kind of the main question there. But and then you look at the Warriors, and I think, the way that they can still execute offense in terms of finding ways to create good opportunities, even without Jimmy Butler for one game, right? I think that was pretty impressive, because you saw, like, the ability for Gary Payton to get slip
Yes.
screens, or the ability for, Buddy Hield, right, to get some of these shots. And
Yeah.
some of them were wild shots, but they went in, right? Quentin Post had 12 rebounds, right? Even though he was 1 for 7, he had 12 rebounds. Kuminga started, didn't do a whole lot, but that's okay, because you had some other guys step up. Steph obviously was the big story. Should have probably started with him.
Mm-hmm.
36, 7, and 9, 5 of 13 from 3. And then, like I said, you got his production, and then you got a little bit of help from some of the role players, and that was all you needed, right? Because, like, you got 36 from Steph, and then you got a combined 33 from Peyton and Hield, which you didn't know if you were going to expect that, right? And if you didn't, you probably lose, right? Because you need at least somebody to kind of give you, maybe not Jimmy Butler level production, but you needed a combination of role players outside of just Steph to be able to step up and give you, some moments. And even like Draymond, his offense has been horrible this series, but he's been very good he's been great defensively,
Amazing.
like breaking up plays, 3 blocks, 3 steals, 8 boards. So there's a lot to like there. And if you're Houston, it kind of feels like that was probably the series right there. Because I think if you had won that game, and you had gotten one game in Golden State and that was the game, then you'd be okay. Because even if you get trounced in game 4, you go back to Houston with the series tied. Not the end of the world. Anything can happen, right? But losing the first game, I think, is tough, because now Butler probably will be back. Maybe he's not, but and I think he'll probably be extra motivated. And I think the Warriors as a whole will feel like, all right, now it's time to end this series. And if Butler comes back, I think that will allow the Warriors, it will give them some more margin for error, just in case some of these other guys don't play well. But like I said, you look at Houston, Jalen Green, 9 points, 4 of 11 from the field. Fred VanVleet started off the game pretty hot. I don't think he made a shot after that point.
Nope.
And then I think the funny thing is, like, you look at Steven Adams, he's been awesome this series. And then Jabari Smith Jr. has had a really good series. But the disappointing part is he's not really out there at the end of games, right? It's kind of some of the other guys that I guess are higher on the depth chart. But they've been disappointing. Like, Amen Thompson just has not been that effective this series, right? Like, I mean, he's the guy guarding Steph, and he's still getting his buckets. I know they're doing different stuff defensively. And again, some of that stuff is like, you're not stopping the superstars necessarily anyways. But I think offensively is the part where you're like, he's gotten these little shots in the lane that he's just not hitting. And he's a, second-year guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was always going to be the tough part for them. You look at Şengün, 7 of 18, left a lot of shots short. And that's the tough part for Houston, is most of the shots that they were missing were at the rim. They shot 39% from 3. So they did their job in terms of the three-point shooting. Again, they got 15 offensive boards. Now, the margin was not as significant because Golden State got 10 offensive rebounds of their own. But all the shots around the rim that were missed, the free throws, they missed 10 free throws in a game where it was mostly, like a few possessions
Yes.
separated, right, for most of the game, because they went up big early and then the Warriors cut it. And that's when I felt like, yeah, they're in trouble because like Golden State offensively looked pretty horrendous for most of the first half, and it was only like a 3-point game. So to me, that's where it felt like you lost the game. And I said, if it's a close game with not a lot of time left on the clock, it's just very difficult to trust Houston. But it's also just sucks because I do think, again, this was a winnable game where, like, I think Şengün missed a dunk early in the
Yes, he
game, right? I
did.
think he had
Yes.
he had an
Wide
open
open.
dunk. Yeah, wide open dunk, just missed it,
Bricked
left
it.
it short, or yeah, bricked it. So just, that's the tough part because, like, you look at the two games they lost, and I know like Golden State was up 20 in game one, but you just felt like both of those games were winnable games. But I think at the same time, this is why it's very difficult, I think, to pick a young team to win the series, against, a tough, experienced team. I think this one was kind of the most likely to be a first round upset. Right now, we're probably going to get another one with Lakers Wolves, right? So obviously, there's a difference there. But, again, I don't think Houston is like a garbage, horrible, horrible team. It's just, again, kind of like Memphis a couple seasons ago. Sacramento, funny enough, who Golden State played a couple years ago. Those were teams that were really good regular season teams. Obviously, Memphis had Ja, so their upper end talent was better. But just as a whole, that's why when it's your first time in the playoffs and you don't have a superstar guy, it's tough to win. So I think, obviously, if Houston loses the series, because the series isn't over, necessarily. Like, I mean, it feels like they're probably going to lose it, but it's not technically over. But I think, obviously, the big talk will be for them, again, the internal development of some of these guys, because these guys are young. So I think, hope they continue to get better. And then I think you also just look at probably need to make an upgrade either in one of the backcourt spots. Like if you keep Jalen Green, then you probably need an upgrade at the point guard spot. And then obviously if you don't keep Jalen Green or someone else, then you just kind of go out and get a star. But there's plenty of time to talk about that should they lose the series, which it kind of feels like they're going to. And shout out to Steph, obviously, because he was awesome, which, I kind of already mentioned.
Yeah, that's the factor, I think, that sets these, two teams apart. Because without Jimmy Butler, I think you look at the Warriors and you're like, well, how on earth are they going to win? Well, the only way that they can win is if, Steph pops off and you get, some pretty good games from other role players and bench guys. And that's exactly what happened, and I think with the Rockets, super frustrating loss. I think probably the most frustrating loss of the series thus far, for sure, because you're going up against the Warriors. They're shorthanded. You did a good job, I think, in the first half. But that fourth quarter, man, it was a complete meltdown. And I think, as much crap that, people are giving Jalen Green and, saying he's garbage, I think Şengün was equally as garbage, if not worse, in this game. I think he was the primary reason they lost, along with Amen Thompson offensively. Like, these guys are just bricking, pretty much gimmies. And it's like, mentally, I think you have to credit the Golden State Warriors, what they do defensively. On that end of the floor, matching the physicality. They might not have the same amount of size, but they don't give up on a play. There's not a lot of miscommunications, and if there are, it's normally on the perimeter, which I think you can kind of afford that against, a team like Houston.
Yeah.
But on the interior, Draymond completely, negating everything that Şengün is doing and completely just making him miss and brick, and then he goes to the line, and it's like you're not even really worried about it because he shoots 1 for 6. And, I feel like they left a lot out there on the table, unnecessarily so. Amen Thompson continues to turn the ball over. I thought the game was officially over when Dillon Brooks fouled out. I was like, all right, no. They have nothing.
They need his production.
On both ends of the floor, and I think that might be a potential problem when you do rely on Dillon Brooks on both ends of the floor. You'd probably like to have him be, more of a defensive kind of guy, but he was hitting his turnarounds, hitting his threes. He was kind of keeping them alive in the fourth quarter. Right. And then, once he fouled out, I was like, okay, that means they're going back to, relying on Van Vliet, Jalen Green, things like that. And it's just not going to work, especially with what the Warriors are able to do defensively. They can bait, even Steph Curry had, I think, 2 blocks, if I'm not mistaken. So that tells you how locked in they were, and with the Warriors. And I do want to defend my boy Amen Thompson defensively. The way that the Rockets play defense, it's good. But when the Warriors are setting screens, hard physical screens like that, you can't just blow it up. It's going to be a foul, number one. So they force the switch. A lot of those points are not on Amin Thompson. Some of them are.
Right.
There are times when he does bait or he does get baited and he jumps on the
Yeah.
pump fake. Like
Yeah.
that happened like I think 5 times, but the majority of the points are on stupid switches, which you credit Golden State for what they're doing, you know, getting guys that should not be on Steph onto Steph, and Steph takes advantage of that every time. Like, you know, Tari Eason's a good perimeter defender, but he's more so known for his ability to get into the lanes and be, you know, even physical down low, I feel like. So, you know, when you have him on Steph, that's not really ideal. You want Thompson there because he's able to face guard him. But, you know, if they're setting off balls, multiple off ball screens, and then an on ball screen, I don't think there's anything that anyone can really do in that situation.
Yeah. And I think, you know, offensively, like, again, the lack of a high level perimeter like playmaker.
Yeah.
I think that's the part that's tough because you're relying on Van Vliet to try to set guys up. And then I think, you know, that would make some of the offense easier because then it's like, then you don't always have to post up Şengün. He could be, you know, just like a roll guy or a potential short roll guy, but, you know, you don't really have that. And then obviously, you know, you could get Jalen Green some easy shots because there were a couple of possessions that I liked where it was like Adams had the ball up top and he kind of set guys up for, you know, because he's a good passer.
Yeah, with the dribble handoff, stuff like that.
Yeah, and they just don't have that. And like, you know, Thompson, he kind of came into the league as a point guard. Now he's playing more forward.
Yeah.
But the tough part is he can't shoot. So it's like, if you're going to develop him as a point guard, he would need to have more of a jump shot. And then obviously, I think the other part, you know, and it's tough because he's a rookie, but I think the fact that like the guy that they drafted 3rd overall is just not playable at all.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. And that was a guy that like most people kind of just was like, this guy's the number 3 pick in the draft, right? And like he's not really he was like a consensus number 3 pick, and it was like, you know, are we sure? I mean, most people thought, yeah, you sure, and he looked good in summer league, but you know, and again, maybe it's tough to ask a rookie, but like given the fact that you look at his skill set, you would almost kind of think maybe he could give you some spot minutes. Tough to put a rookie in that type of situation, and that could be something in the future. Because I don't want to write a guy off after 1 year, but it kind of feels like they may have whiffed with that pick. I mean, we'll see.
Agree.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. And again, if you're relying on Reed Shepherd to win you playoff games anyways, that would be a major problem.
I think it's more so the idea of what Reed Shepherd could be, you know?
The archetype of a guy who can, you know, be a point guard and be like a high-level playmaker passer, but also like a decent shooter, potential scorer. You don't have that because Green can be a scorer, sometimes playmaker, sometimes shooter, but it's just very streaky, which is okay because he's a young guy, even though he's in year 4. But, you know, that's where I think like it kind of limits the offensive ceiling of so many of these guys where when you don't have that, whereas you look at the other side of the floor and it's like, you know, Steph can play point guard, right? Like he had 9 assists in this game. He had a lot more on ball duties because Butler was out. You know, obviously even Draymond can run their offense and, you know, they have other guys that can kind of, you know, set up some offense at the top of the key anyways. It's just tough because like you look at some of the other supporting cast guys for Golden State and it's like, are those guys really are they really better than some of the guys that Houston has?
No, they're not.
It's like, no, not really. Like even a guy like Kuminga who's in year 4 kind of just looked lost.
Nope, not good. Pajemski, not good. I'm telling you.
Yeah, like that, and that's I think the disappointing part. But the high end talent is what wins out, and that's gonna be the tough part for you. But again, like if you're the Rockets, like it's less of a disappointment for them to lose this series than Golden State, even though Houston's the higher seed, because Houston wasn't looked at as like a potential contender.
Yeah.
They're playing with house money. They've never been to the playoffs before, aside from a couple of the vets who aren't necessarily like their best players necessarily. So it's a letdown if you're the Rockets. And again, series is not over, so we can't completely talk like it's over. It just felt like that game, if they lose the series, is going to be the swing game. That's the difference. Kind of like I think with the Lakers when they lost Game 3. Like, of course, the series isn't over, but it felt like, yeah, it might be over. And if it is, you lost. Like losing that game was probably going to be, you know, the difference. And it kind of was. And for this one, I think it will be. I did pick Golden State to win this series, but of course, still a decent amount of basketball to go. So the series is not over. It looks like we got, while we were talking, it looks like we got a notification from Chris Haynes where they believe that Damian Lillard tore his Achilles. He got hurt because I saw him get hurt in the game and he had to come out. But it sounds like he's might have a torn Achilles, which is awful.
Yeah.
I yeah. So obviously, to get one at the end of the season is in the playoffs is brutal because that pretty much means out obviously for the rest of this series, and then out for pretty much most of, if
Yep.
not all of next season as well. So the Bucks are playing right now as we speak. Um, can't really talk about the game because it's going on as
Yeah,
we're discussing.
they're down 10 right now
Yeah,
as we
yeah.
speak
So
right now.
they won game three. They bounced back. And that was with Lillard again, not doing a whole lot. But
Yeah.
that's the tough part where I just think it's going to be a tall task to climb for Milwaukee to win the series without some level of offensive production from somebody outside of Giannis. And then obviously, if Lillard's, if he's got the torn Achilles, which is what they think happened, then that's like to me like a complete dagger in terms of Milwaukee's chances, and that's just awful. Especially because again, this is a guy who worked his way back from blood clots, for a few weeks, and now then he gets a torn Achilles right after. It's just horrible.
Yeah, probably the worst, I think, news for Bucks fans, for Damian Lillard himself, because like you said, um, to be battling, blood clots and beat that, and then now have to go through something, you know, just as bad. I feel like, that's the worst thing ever, and the Bucks might be cooked after this one.
Yeah, well, and again, we'll see what happens after. I mean, again, probably by the time we probably will be done with this before the game is over. But just as a whole, it's just been that kind of season for the Bucks where it just feel like you just feel super just kind of down about what's happened with them because I know we went into the season with not a ton of expectations from the Bucks, but then it was kind of cool to see them bounce back and start to play well. They were still very up and down, but to have it kind of this series probably end pretty soon, and then also Lillard's out with a torn Achilles. I don't really know what, and we'll get into the Bucks again. We'll have all the offseason talks for these teams when they get eliminated, but I don't know what the Bucks do after this series, assuming they lose and Lillard's out with a torn Achilles. Like I
Yeah.
don't really know what to do after that because they don't have a ton anyways after Dame
Yeah.
and Giannis
You
and
can't really move
this
any young guys, so
yeah, and again, this was one that we whiffed. We whiffed on this
big
one.
time.
We'll admit it. Like we knew the Pacers were the better team going in. We thought maybe Giannis and some other guys could maybe get them over the top, but it's just again, this is kind of the NBA we're in now, where depth is super important. League is super talented,
Yeah.
and you could have the best guy on the floor by a decent amount, and it's tough to win. But we'll see what happens. Then another huge game, couple of games. I don't think we. So I think the Clippers Nuggets series. I want to say it was 1-1
Yes, it
when
was.
we last recorded. Then
Yes.
obviously we had game three where the Clippers just annihilated Denver. I think they won by 34, and it kind of felt like, yeah, that series might be done.
Hmm.
Denver might be cooked, but they're still hanging around. They ended up pulling off a win in game four, tying the series at 2-2. 101-99 in a game in which they looked strong in the first half, but it was close and it was back and forth. Then the Clippers and the Nuggets got into a scuffle for some reason. It
Yeah.
just kind of felt like, obviously a lot of these series have been very tight and very testy, but just it kind of felt like that moment it was a little surprising
Hmm.
that it got out of hand the way it did. I mean, again, I'm glad that they didn't throw anybody out because I don't think anybody deserved to get thrown out. I
Agreed.
was perfectly fine with handing out 6 techs or whatever it
Agreed.
was. And, it was nice because then we got rewarded with a great second half, but kind of a surprising second half because the Nuggets it felt like it woke them up where they just kind of started running away with it, went up big in the third, started the fourth up by like 20 plus, and then almost had a generational choke job
Yep.
where like last year, right, they were up 20 in the second half of game 7, albeit in the third quarter, so
Hmm.
a little bit different.
Hmm.
But it was kind of like the Lakers where they had their 5 guys out there for the vast majority of the second half. They were running out of gas, playing on fumes, and the Clippers just stormed back into the game.
Yeah.
Looked like they had stolen the game
Yeah.
because they went up, 90? I want to say, what was it, like 99, 97 or
Yep.
whatever? Yeah, and then Jokic hits the great crazy turnaround. He had an amazing game. 36 points, 21 rebounds, 8 assists, 2 steals, a block, 3 of 6 from 3. This is the type of game that you needed from him in
Mhm.
order to win another game.
Yep.
You were going to have a great Jokic game, I think, if you want to stay alive. I think you would have liked to have a great Jokic and Murray game. Murray, not so much.
Mhm.
5 of 17. Hit a couple big shots in the fourth to stave off the Clipper comeback, but by and large, was not very
Very
effective.
underwhelming.
Christian Brown had probably his best game of the series, probably one of his best postseason performances in quite some time. He was 1 for 7 from three.
They did
It was pretty
this
ugly.
without Russ, by the way.
Yeah, and without Russell Westbrook. So
Yep.
again, basically 5 guys for most of the game,
Mhm.
and then like 12 minutes of Peyton Watson, and then like a combined 12 minutes from DeAndre Jordan, Vlatko Chanchar, excuse me, and Jalen Pickett.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the type of depth they were working with. In other words, none. But for Brown, I thought it was impressive because he was playing pretty bad, I think, early in the game where the shots weren't falling, playing out of control, passing up some shots, and just kind of running into brick walls.
Mhm.
But then in the second half, he made himself available. He got some putbacks, he got out in transition, then hit a big 3
Yep.
to put the Nuggets up. Michael Porter Jr. playing with a bad shoulder, huge game, 17 points, 4 rebounds. Shout out to him because that's really impressive given how horrible he was in game 1. And then Aaron Gordon kind of ended up being the hero of the game because it's a tie game. Jokic throws up a prayer, and then Gordon gets the ball and dunks it in with literally less than a second to go, literally right at the buzzer.
Yep.
Half a second later, it doesn't count, and they probably go into overtime and probably lose the
Yeah.
game. But just kind of crazy, just from the Nuggets where they had enough resolve to punch back, go up big, then completely choke, and then find a way to come back and get the win. And then for the Clippers, it's funny because like if you're the Clippers, maybe you don't feel too bad about this from the perspective of like it feels like the games that you've lost were all winnable games. Even this one where the Nuggets were up literally 20 plus points in the fourth quarter. The Clippers had the lead
Mhm.
with less than a minute to go. And they bungled it away again. This one is kind of like, what do you expect? But like at the same, because it's very difficult to come back from a big deficit. You got to expend a lot of energy. But if I thought when the Nuggets lost the lead, I actually thought they were going to lose the game and
So
give it
did
away
I.
to the Clippers.
Yep.
But just as a whole, you look around at the Clippers and you didn't really get it. And the stats are kind of skewed because of the fourth quarter comeback. But most of the main Clippers guys were not very impactful for most of the game. Kawhi had like some moments. But just as a whole, like the comeback kind of makes their stats look better than they really were. Obviously, the stat lines would look great if they won the game. So that's kind of a big difference. You saw with Dunn, they left him open a lot from 3, and he didn't make them pay this time. But, again, when you're down 20, it's not because of one guy. Like, most of their main guys stunk it up in this game, and they still had a chance to win the game. So, it still doesn't make me feel great about our Nuggets in 7 prediction. But, if you're the Nuggets, you get back home court, you live to fight another day, you won one with literally no depth. So, you were kind of forced to play literally everybody big minutes, but I don't know. It's hard to say because it's still not a pick that I'm feeling amazing about. Like, it feels like what the Nuggets have to do to pull out, a couple of these wins just feels like a lot more than what the Clippers have to do. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So,
I know what you mean.
like, like you go back to Denver, we don't know what's gonna happen, but again, like worst case scenario, obviously it goes 6. We figured it would go probably 6 or 7. Both of us picked the Nuggets to win in 7. And again, it was a great Jokic game, which is what you needed because I thought even though his stat line was not necessarily bad through the series, it felt like it was kind of like some of his more well, it's kind of a double, but like it feels like some of those numbers or performances were a little bit less impressive.
Yeah, not the
Which
best
again,
version of him.
yeah, exactly. Which is a testament again to how good he is, right?
Mhm.
When you factor in like, hey, those stat lines still look really good. But, and again, it's tough because you got Zubac. The Clippers kind of know how to swarm and make it tough. And I think there's a fatigue factor because, even his free throw shooting, he was 5 of 6 in this game. But just, how many times in this series has he missed some late game free throws? And it's just kind of, wild to see. But at the same time, again, this was a game where like your superstar showed up, your supporting cast, by and large, outside of Murray, all made big plays. So this was a win that you needed to get, and it was a good bounce back win from Denver. But I need to see more when they go back home in Game 5 to make me feel good about them potentially winning the series. If they win Game 5, I think they have a good shot at winning the series. I wouldn't guarantee it because again, even though we know the stats, when you win Game 5, you usually win the series. They could easily go into Game 6 on the road and completely blow it. So, it all kind of depends on what we're going to see. But at the very least, this was a good, decent win for Denver. But at the same time, it's pretty harrowing how, like, even with a 20-point lead, you're not safe because you literally have nobody off the bench that you can count on, which is why I still don't feel great about the Nuggets' chances. But,
Yeah.
these guys, Jokic is keeping them in it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where you do have to start. This is kind of the product of, a series where you are going to have, the best player on the floor, throughout the whole series, and Jokic is probably going to get you over the edge. And I think that's why a lot of people did pick, the Denver Nuggets. But, by the time it does go to 7, say they do, get out of the series, they have to play what? The Thunder, right?
Yeah, they have to. Yeah, whoever wins this series has to play Oklahoma City.
Yeah, and they're gonna be freaking gassed, man. Especially if it goes to 7, like. But that's kind of neither here nor there at this point. But in this series, it's been peak, back and forth, and the Nuggets, I really feel like, have just kind of found a way and a will when I feel like there wasn't really a way
The
because
dark magic is back. The dark
exactly.
magic is back.
Yeah, like something's fishy
For now.
because no way, man. Like when if you watch that game live, you're kind of in your head like, what was Jokic even thinking with that last shot?
Yeah,
Realistically, I mean, we've seen him
right.
make it, which is the scary part. But even then, it's like double teamed,
Yeah,
and then when it airballed, I was like, oh wow, we're going to OT, and out of nowhere,
yeah,
Aaron Gordon punches it. I'm like, wow, phenomenal. So a great ending in terms of that. But even
yeah,
then, I feel like if you're Denver, you just got to be like, can we get a breather, man? This is ridiculous.
yeah,
Like,
right.
how are they going to get out of this series alive? That's kind of my question because I feel like with the
Yeah,
Clippers, if you look at the box score, like you said, you got some interesting performances from a lot of the role players, but by and large, the main guys like Kawhi, James Harden, I feel like they weren't all that great
they were
throughout.
back. Yeah,
Exactly, all that great throughout 3 quarters, but then they rallied a little bit, but also Denver, I feel like just blew it. Realistically, they really just blew it.
yeah,
Defensive lapses, offensively couldn't really find the ball going in, and how do they look going home? Granted, they'll have a little bit of rest, but I don't know. I feel like the Clippers might take one in Denver, and then
yeah,
Denver takes the one in LA, and then we go back to Denver, and who knows? But
yeah,
that's kind of just been the pattern of the series. But overall, like you said, it starts with Jokic. He had a fantastic game. These are the kinds of games that you need from him where, he's dominant on the boards. He's efficient, from all 3 levels on the floor, and he's getting other guys involved. Maybe not necessarily, the most efficient game from Jamal Murray, but even then, Jokic still had, 8 assists, and the
yeah,
turnovers were down low, much lower than, a couple of his other games that he's had,
yeah.
in the
Two,
series. Yeah,
two.
exactly. So you could tell he was really locked in, very adamant, animated, even, with dealing with his coach, Adelman. So, I think the fire is there for the Nuggets to win the series. It's just the way that they're winning these games. I'm really taken aback by it because
Yeah,
it's a very different way of of playoff basketball, at least from their perspective, than we've seen in previous years. I don't think we've seen them
yeah,
really, have to deal with adversity like this.
yeah. Because like we've seen like them have those games where it's like, oh, there's no way they win this game, and
Hmm.
then they find a way to win it.
Hmm.
But like this one was almost like the inverse because it's
Right.
like no way they should have lost this.
Right.
They should have lost it and then still found a way to win.
Yeah.
And it's tough. Like I feel like if you're the Clippers, I think you gotta kind of almost feel like, shoot, we could be up like 3-1 or 4-zip
Yeah.
or
They could
something.
have swept
Just
them.
based off, yeah, just based off of like how this goes. And I think that's the tough part. Like you kind of mentioned, like whoever comes out of this series, regardless of if it's the Nuggets or the Clippers, is going to be bruised and battered. Like you said, having to play Oklahoma City, who's going to have like a full week's worth of rest. Um, and then at the same time, they're also going to have home court, and all these guys are having to play pretty heavy minutes. So, I mean, that's the part that I think, is tough because, like, when you come back from a big deficit, you never want to waste it. And it was kind of wasted because you ended up losing the game and you kind of just put needless minutes on a bunch of guys, right? And now they have to do it again and muster it up again. But again, I think at least say like a Norman Powell, he was pretty good in the fourth quarter, leading the Clipper comeback, hitting some big shots. And that's kind of the thing that scares me, when we pick with us picking the Nuggets to win, because what if these guys just come out like game 3 and just kind of have a hot night where, and I know they're not like a high volume 3-point shooting team, I don't think, but just as a whole, if any of these guys get hot, I don't know, you're kind of in trouble. But Denver defensively for most of the game I thought played very well, and again, that's their key to win these games is can they play any sort of defense whatsoever. I mean, you held the Clippers to under 100 points. And again, it took a frenetic comeback where the Nuggets did literally everything wrong. So,
Yeah,
like, for most of the game, their defense was great. But then, they just kind of found a way to blow it in the fourth, but still managed to pull it out. This has been, again, I think most people expected this to be the most entertaining series in the
100%.
first round, and it definitely has been. I mean, you had one hideous game, but, and that was the game where it was like, people were complaining because that one was on NBA TV, whereas the Memphis OKC one was on TNT, and it was like, yeah, no, you didn't miss much.
Yeah,
Like,
really.
you didn't miss
Yeah,
much.
you're right.
Like, yeah, I saw that game on NBA TV, and it was, we didn't even talk about it because it was just a beatdown from the Clippers,
For
right?
sure,
So
yeah.
just as a whole, at least a couple more games to go. Give me more of this,
Yeah,
though,
I wanna see
because I
more, yeah.
think this has been really impressive.
Yeah, I agree.
Then moving on, um, Boston, Orlando. Before we got on, the game was kind of in the mix, and then the Celtics ended up pulling it out. So now they go up 3-1 to take the commanding lead over the Magic. Again, not pretty, not the most aesthetically pleasing game,
Yeah.
but just as a whole, again, this is the argument for why the Celtics are still a very dangerous team because we talked about it with the Magic where it's like, even though they're a 7 seed and they've been banged up, they do have some good high end talent and they're very good defensively. So there's always a world where you could have a couple of games where you stink on the offensive end and they find ways to contain you. And
Yep.
then all of a sudden, it's a super low scoring game. Paolo just randomly or Franz randomly gets hot, or some other role player for Orlando comes in and hits some shots. And then before you know it, you lost, like what happened in game 3. But then, of course, game 3, the Magic almost blew. And the Magic had a chance to win this one. But then you look around, like Paolo, 12 for 32, 31 points on 32 shots. Again, we talked about with the Magic, the lack of outside shooting and just the lack of like, a decent, mix of like guys that can kind of help out Paolo and Franz
Mhm.
offensively.
Mhm.
Like you don't really fault them for being, inefficient. Like it's not, because it's just not like an ideal offensive situation to be in. I mean, at least you got some decent games from Corey Joseph and KCP, but the fact that you got to rely on Corey Joseph and KCP to be good is not a great sign.
Yeah.
But also, especially if when KCP, this is probably his best shooting game in a while because he's been pretty bad this season,
Horrible.
and in this series he's been pretty off, just as a whole. I mean, Anthony Black had decent moments, but just as a whole, Celtics showed why they're better, why they were clearly favored to win this series. I mean, pretty obvious. And it's funny, right? Because Peyton Pritchard, couple of good games, the first couple of games, and then didn't do much in this game, at least offensively. He competed on the defensive end, but then you got a pretty balanced offensive attack because you got 18 from Derek White, you got 21 from Jaylen Brown. Didn't shoot well, but did make some good defensive plays and had 11 rebounds. Porzingis had 19, so bounce back game for him. Had some stretches where he wasn't able to play. I'm not really sure what was going on, but I guess he's still dealing with some
Yeah.
stuff.
I think it might
And
have been
then
maybe I don't think it was the stitches, right?
yeah, but like you, because he was on the bike.
Yeah.
But you never know. And then Tatum, of course, this is his series. This is the Tatum series, right? He had 37 or whatever the other night, 37 tonight. Didn't shoot well from 3. I mean, 3 for 10. You make one more shot and that's 40%. So
Sure.
it's like, who cares? but made all of his free throws,
Yep.
14 of 14. That's huge. And again, continued to rebound, continued to defend. And this is why, this is the case for why, even with the Celtics feeling a little worse from last season, this is why you still have to look at them as a legitimate championship level team, because you got Tatum, who's a superstar, right? He's clearly continued to ascend. This is his best basketball that we've seen him play this year. And your supporting cast is still good because Porzingis is now somewhat healthy, had a couple of rough games. Brown's playing through stuff. Drew Holiday didn't play.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the thing with the Celtics is like, somebody's been in and out each game, and they've still found ways to get some guys to contribute. Even Sam Hauser made a couple of shots, right?
Yeah.
Because he's been pretty absent for most of this series, and for most of the season, he hasn't really been that amazing. Which, again, most of his offense comes from three. So sometimes guys can have up and down shooting seasons. But for the Celtics, really it just came down to get out of the series alive, try to avoid as many injuries as you can because Orlando is a big physical athletic team. Tatum got hurt, but looks fine, looks pretty good,
Yeah.
right? So I think you feel good about that. Brown's still obviously playing through some knee stuff, and then Drew Holiday hamstring, I guess. But as a whole, this was one of those series where it's like you don't want to play around. You want to get out of here as fast as you can. Even losing game 3 is kind of tough, but as a whole, winning in 5 if they can isn't bad. You got one in Orlando. You just got to go back to Boston and close it out, and then presumably play, the winner of the Knicks Pistons, which probably the Knicks.
Yeah, and it's like with Orlando, they're no pushover in terms of their defense. Like, and that's the cool part about this team. And I think this series, it's a great experience for the young guys. Like we've already been preaching. Paolo and Franz, they need this. This is what their second playoff series together. So that's really good. And even in this game specifically, like the Magic were pretty much there the entire game.
Yeah.
Obviously until late in the fourth quarter. So there's promise, there's potential. I want to see them get healthy. I want to see them get some extra pieces, and I think they'll be around for a while. But for Boston, like you said, the key is they've been doing not necessarily well. I will say dominating this series. I think they have been dominating this series. With some key injuries, and I think that's a big thing for them because if they are fully healthy, come Eastern Conference Finals, it should be they should be going back to back potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing again for them is in these earlier rounds, gotta, for the first round, you gotta be healthy. You gotta look the part. And again, the funny thing is they haven't shot the ball that well.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you kind of expect it because Orlando's one of the best defensive teams in the league, even without
Exactly.
Jalen Suggs. They've been, the second best defensive team in the league, right? I think behind Oklahoma City, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, sir.
So just as a whole, this is one of those series where it's like, wow, they didn't have to knock down like a ridiculous ton of threes, in order to win some of these games. And again, with Orlando, you get a little bit of a breather because, offensively, they're not the most, adept team. But again, at the same time, this is a series that I think is a good test for the Celtics, just from the perspective of it kind of felt like the tenor coming out of game 3 felt sort of like they were of this mindset, like that they kind of expected Orlando to kind of just fall down and just kind of, beat themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, hey, they're the lower seed. They're probably just going to play in a way where like they're just going to kind of give games away. And like you said, Orlando's not a pushover.
Yeah.
They have some good players on that team, especially at the high end. But for the Celtics, they kind of punch back and they got physical too. And that's what you want to see from them. Like I said, if you pick them to make a deep run or win the title again, is there a ton you can take away from this matchup? Maybe not necessarily, but like I said, the main thing that I think you like is Tatum looks great. Porzingis has the stitches and has not had like an amazing series, but at
Right.
least he's out there. At least he's out there contributing in some way, shape, or form.
Exactly.
Because you're gonna need him, I think, for the later rounds. Even in the next matchup, whomever they play, think you're gonna need him ideally. And especially I think to go all the way, you want him
Oh yeah.
a healthy available. But
He's got to be there.
like you said, yeah, but guys being in and out, again, Orlando's shorthanded, so it's not like they're fully healthy. But just as a whole, good first round for the result for Boston. Like I said, we'll see if they close it out in 5. But again, this is why most people thought Orlando could win a game. Because you could have a game where Paolo goes off, the Celtics suck on offense, and Orlando kind of holds them to under 100 points, and that's kind of an environment that Orlando can win, relatively fine.
Yes.
But if it's like a shootout, that's kind of a tough, that's kind of a tough situation for them to be in.
Yeah, they can't keep up.
Yeah. Then last but not least, Cleveland, Miami. This was probably the least interesting series, I would say,
Agreed.
given the discrepancy between these two teams, right? Cleveland with 64 wins and Miami with 37 wins, so almost a difference of 30 games. But I think, from the Cavs perspective, again, it's kind of like OKC, where, they did great during the regular season. How does it look in the playoffs? Do they take it seriously? Do they take advantage of the opportunities that they're given to try to close out some of these games? Because not all, like game 3 was a beatdown. But like game 2 was kind of competitive, right? Game 1 was competitive for like what, 3 quarters or so. Like it wasn't like, oh, this is a lock. Like you kind of figured they would win the game, but it was probably closer than I think you might have liked to have seen. But just as a whole, like each game, the Cavs have looked better and better. Game 3, Darius Garland didn't even play, and it was still a pretty convincing win, right? And I think part of that is like your defense isn't different at all. If Darius Garland doesn't play, you could make the case it might be better. And if you're still getting contributions from guys like Ty Jerome and DeAndre Hunter, along with the usual suspects for the Cavs, they're starters. That's what you like. That's what you want to see if you're the Cavs, because that's the big thing is that like the strength of their team is the offense and then also the depth, right? Because so to see Max Strus knocking down shots and then off the bench, DeAndre Hunter and Ty Jerome playing pretty well. And then they're even kind of able to put out some of those other guys that we didn't see a ton of, like say like a Dean Wade and others. That's key for them, just because of the fact that if it turns into like, oh, we only have 5 guys like some of these other teams, that might be a potential problem. Now
Yeah.
their 5 guys are still very good. Their
Yeah.
5 best players are really good. But just as a whole, if you can get the contributions from those bench guys, that's great, because that means you're probably going to have like at least a good 7, 8 players to roll with in every game. And you got a couple of guys that maybe you could interchange. Like Okoro kind of feels like now you plug him in like in case of emergency. Like he
Sure.
doesn't even feel like a main rotational player for them now. It feels like he's been kind of phased out, where he was a starter and they were relying on him heavily last year,
Yeah.
right? So now you got a couple of other guys in there. And with Jerome, his offense like seemingly still carrying over into the playoffs. That's good, because that gives you another guard you can put out there that can give you some buckets, give you some playmaking and facilitating, but gives you a little bit more size and probably a little bit more defensive versatility from Garland, and maybe gives you a little bit of a safety cushion in case he has a bad game. I'm not saying that like he's not, obviously he's not better than Garland, but just it gives you an extra guy to put out there in case he has a stinky game, because
Yeah.
there's gonna probably be games where it's like this is a Mitchell game, this is a Mitchell takeover game, so we kind of need to make sure that the ball's in Mitchell's hands, and then like other guys can play. Not that Garland can't, but you know
Sure.
what I mean. Just as a whole, we know there's gonna be some teams and matchups where they're gonna hunt Garland defensively.
Oh
I
yeah,
know
big time.
Garland. The game plan was to pick on Hero, which is not wrong, right? It's not wrong at all. But guys are going to pick on him too. But
Didn't Tyler
at,
Hero say the same thing? If I'm
I
not
believe he
mistaken.
did.
Yeah, he's like,
Yeah,
yeah, we were gonna pick
there's
up
not. Yeah,
on freaking Darius Garland. Like,
yeah. It's just there's not much the Heat can do about it. But just as a
exactly.
whole, again, I think for the Cavs, it's just again the main thing you wanted to see was, do they take this first round matchup seriously? Do they take care of business relatively quickly? So far, they have. We'll see if they sweep them. I'm going to assume they will, and then they'll be going to the second round to face whomever wins between Pacers and Bucks. Probably Pacers. Maybe the Bucks have a couple games in them. We don't know, but without Dame, it may be a little bit more difficult to find some offense again, unless some guys heat up. But either way, like if you're the Cavs, this is practice. Like you're basically like kind of getting some playoff minutes, figuring out some of your rotational stuff, getting guys used to some playoff basketball, which some of these guys already are used to, but a couple of them are, new faces for this team. So again, all positives I would say from the Cavs. Like, yeah, it would be cool if they blew them out like 50 every game. Just like it'd be cool if OKC blew Memphis out every
Yeah,
game.
exactly.
Right? But that's just not the case.
Yeah, I kind of look at this series the same way that I looked at, the Memphis Oklahoma City series, where it's like you said, it's reps for Cleveland. They're dominating the series. They're up 3-0. I expect them to sweep, as they should. They're deep. They've got, plenty of bench guys to come in there and impact the game on both ends of the floor. Like you were talking about Isaac Okoro. Yeah, he's not a reliable guy that they bring in for offense, but sometimes when he's out there defensively, it does raise the ceiling of their team to be like kind of that undersized stopper. And then DeAndre Hunter, having great games off the bench as well, coupled with your starters popping off. They're the OKC of the East.
Yeah. And then I guess also just kind of to add in, because they actually were eliminated, Memphis Grizzlies.
Mm.
What do we really do with them? Because you look at their regular season and they were 48 and 34.
Mm.
Started off the first half of the season, right, as the top, 3 team in the Western Conference, right? Like I think just, before the All-Star break, they were like 36 and 18. And then the rest of the way, they're like, 12 and 16?
Mm-hmm.
So really stumbled the rest of the way. And then had some injuries by the end, Jalen Wells, Brandon Clark. And then obviously they kind of stumble into the playoffs as the 8th seed. Then Ja gets hurt. And now they go from being a top 4 seed in the Western Conference to going out in the first round. And this was a team that we kind of thought would be a top 4 seed going into this regular season, because we felt like Ja's going to be back. The 3 main guys are going to be playing. You got some new guys to add into the rotation, and then you kind of go from there. But it kind of feels like now, not only is it a disappointment, but what do you do from the perspective of, now you're going to have to pay Jaren Jackson Jr., right? This series, I think he was kind of underwhelming. He had his moments, but by and large, I think it was kind of a rough one for him. Again, even with Ja, he didn't look great, right? Like and again, I don't want to make it seem like he shouldn't be paid, but you just look at it like, assuming you pay Jaren Jackson Jr., which I think they will, then you're going to be paying 3 guys like big max money, and it just doesn't feel like that the team is probably good enough to really go that far. Like they were a top seed for most of the year, but then they couldn't defend. They fired the coach. So maybe you make the case, get some different personnel, because they do have, because then you look around and like, yeah, there are some guys in that rotation that are not great defensively. Marcus Smart could have helped, but he wasn't healthy. They gave him away, gave up a first. Now they don't even have the first. I think it goes to Washington,
Yep,
if I'm not
it will be
mistaken.
the
Right?
18th
So,
pick in the draft. FYI.
exactly. So that would have been nice to have. And I guess they got off his money, so maybe that'll free up, space to bring in, re-sign Jaren Jackson Jr. But it's just tough because it just feels like, you're kind of just running back the same core, and I just don't know how much further you can go. Like it feels like maybe they might have maxed out. I mean, of course, we'll see if those other young guys continue to develop, but they were starting 2 rookies, right? Jalen Wells, Zach Edey, and they both guys I think showed stretches where they both look like they're going to be pretty impactful players, right? Jalen Wells is a 3-and-D wing. Edey is like, rebounding, sometimes shot blocking big, right? There's still some things he needs to work out, so it still doesn't feel great. But just as a whole, it just feels like that there's something missing. And I do kind of wonder, like, could this be one of those teams that in the summer moves on from one of their core guys and maybe makes a big move? I don't know, because I'm not saying that they are. It just, what, like, if you're the Grizzlies, what's the goal for this team? Like, it seems like the goal going into the season was to have a bounce back revenge year and be like a real contender,
Yeah,
right?
get
Like,
out of
be
the
a
first
team that,
round.
yeah, exactly. Get to the second round at least, right? Which basically means be one of the 8 best remaining teams, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So, like, and it just, they were for a while, but then they fell off, and I don't really know what you do, because like some of the guys, are not great defensive players. Like Ja's not great defensively. Bane's all right, he's okay, but he's not like an elite high level defensive guard. He can make some plays, but still. Then Wells is good. Jaren Jackson Jr. is good, but commits a lot of stupid fouls, right? We know that. We've seen it. It still happens, even at this point. Happened in this series, happened in the play-in game, so
Yeah.
it's clearly still going to happen. And it's tough because it feels like ideally it'd be nice if he could just play the 5, and then you could kind of get like a more, I don't know, like conventional lineup in there, sort of like, or maybe a little bit more switchable.
Sure.
But you can't, because he doesn't rebound. He's not, I don't think, quite physical enough against certain matchups. He's improved as a post player, but his preference is to shoot jumpers, right? Like that's his thing, and he still had a really awesome year.
Mhm.
Like, don't get me wrong, and I'm not trying to, just kind of just talk down about him because I think he is, a really good player. But at the same time, it just feels like what is the ceiling with this group? It doesn't feel like a team where the ceiling is, second round conference finals. It kind of is starting to feel more like, yeah, they might be a good regular season team, but probably a first round exit. Of course, get some vets. I don't think they had anybody over the age of 30. You had a vet, but he couldn't play because he
Mhm.
wasn't healthy. So that was the problem there. But what would you do? Because it just kind of feels like, I don't want to completely say they're stuck, but it just kind of feels like that if, not much changes relatively soon, they're going to be kind of just like stuck in the middle where it's like they're not bad, right? Like, because 48 wins, you're not a bad team, but probably not good enough to feel like this is a perennial contender.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they have a cap. That's kind of the way that I would say it, in terms of where they can be and probably, where realistically they are going to be. I think you do have to kind of put the team under a microscope, and I think it does start with Ja. I think I'm not saying, trade him, but I think you might have to field some offers because, the durability and lack of thereof, has been, I think, very disappointing, especially, come postseason. A lot of their seasons have pretty much ended because his season has ended, and that's coincided
Right.
with it, So that's something to watch out for because I think I even talked about it, before the playoffs even started. Like him and Zion are
Yeah.
pretty much on the same track, in terms of
True.
playoff availability. You know what I mean?
Although he did say he felt like that they could have won the series if he was healthy.
I mean,
So
I feel like I feel like I like the confidence. Like I feel like they could have won, a couple games if he was healthy, but I don't know. I realistically, it's not just him. It's the whole team. Like look at the guys that
right.
they were missing. They were missing multiple guys who were key parts of their rotation that
Yeah.
make them a better
Brandon
team.
Clark.
Brandon Clark
Brandon
and
Clark.
Jalen Wells, and then look at the year before that. One of the most injured teams I think of all time. So it's
Yep.
like health. I don't know what's going on with the health stuff over there. And the problem I think with Ja is he's a part of a dying breed, realistically. Think about how many,
Okay.
uber athletic point guards that we have, undersized guys, that go to the rim like that. There's not a lot of them. I feel like he's like what, one of maybe like two realistically, and it has to be in that tier of Ja. Like,
Scoot.
huh?
Scoot.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say Scoot, but that's why I said in Ja Morant's tier. I don't think Scoot is in the same tier.
Right.
So that I
I,
think is a little bit
I,
concerning. Where it's like dying breed. Pretty much every season ends with some sort of injury, which also
mhm.
ends the team season and coincides. But I'm not saying trade him. I'm just saying field offers. If you like an offer that you're comfortable
Mhm.
with, or you feel like it, frees up, that whole injury grasp that, that, that just bugs
Right.
Memphis. I don't know how and why, because I think they do have solid guys. Like, I'm not the biggest Desmond Bain fan, but I think you do have to acknowledge, his skill and what he brings to the table. And, there were stretches during this season when Ja was out and the Grizzlies actually looked pretty dang good. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
Jaren Jackson Jr. looked great on both ends of the floor. And, they have depth pieces like Scottie Pippen Jr. He's been solid, definitely
Yeah.
a guy that you have to keep around some way, somehow. But I don't know. I feel like realistically there is a peak, and for some reason I feel like they might run it back. It wouldn't surprise me if they do run it back, and like you said, maybe move on from some of the filler pieces and bring in maybe some veterans who can show these guys what it's like to be in the playoffs. But it also comes down to development. I think are you going to get anything from GG Jackson next year? How good does Zach Edey look in his second year? Having a full season of experience under his belt. I think you are banking on a little bit of progression, maturity as well. But I don't know. I think it does start with John. You do have to kind of question, is he going to lead your franchise out of the first round? Because so far he hasn't.
Right. I think they've gotten out of the first round once?
Exactly.
Yeah, because that was 22, I think, right?
Yes.
Because they beat the
And that was his
Wolves.
spectacular year.
Yeah, they beat the Wolves and then they lost to Golden State. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, because again, the way you look at it is, it's like then you got to ask yourself, all right, if you're gonna trade Ja, like like you said, you're not saying you're trading him, but then like if you're fielding offers, it's like, what are you looking for? Are you looking for like a star in a similar tier? Are you looking for like depth pieces, like that's kind of the question where it's like then you got to think about, all right, well, what other team has like a quote unquote, maybe not disgruntled, but some other quote unquote star where it's like, hey, we'll take them off your hands. And, I'm not sure which one that is. But like you said, Memphis does have a lot of good pieces, which is why, it doesn't feel like you should blow it up. But then you also factor in the CPA.
Yeah,
Once you pay Jaren Jackson Jr., they're going to be presumably like a second apron or close to a team, right? Like they'll definitely be above the first apron. But because like Cleveland with Evan Mobley winning Defensive Player of the Year, like they're gonna be in the second apron, but they feel like a team where like they can afford that because it feels like that they're a legit championship level
I
team.
agree.
I mean, we'll see what they do in the playoffs, but like it's tough to be anywhere close to the second apron if you don't feel like you're a championship level team because it's so limiting, right? Like if you're the Celtics, you can be a second apron team because you got the pieces to be a championship level team. Like you have those pieces, right?
Yeah.
You can, I don't think OKC's in the second apron yet, but they will be once they pay those guys,
Hmm.
and then that'll change probably the outlook of what their team is. But if you're the Grizzlies, you're not close to those teams, and there has to be a level of like part of it has got to be that like your best player, like you said, isn't as reliable health wise and like just doesn't quite seem as good as maybe some of the other top guys in the league. Like a few seasons ago, he was, right? Like he was like, rising and like kind of in that tier with a lot of the other young superstars, but now it feels like he's kind of leveled back and kind of fallen down a little bit. And he played well to close out the season, but just as a whole, it like, it's like there was a stretch where like he was in the same tier as like Ant and
I
like
agree. Yeah.
say
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess maybe like a Book or an SGA or like something like that. But
Yeah.
like all those, well, Book is kind of falling back, but that's because his team sucks.
Yeah.
But
This
like
team
say
is
just from like
garbage.
yeah, but like say with like a Ja, it feels like a lot of those other guys that are like similar ages or like similar tiers have kind of moved ahead of him and have kind of
Yep.
passed him by.
Yep.
And that's where you kind of do have to ask yourself like, can we really go that far with this as our group? And I don't think the answer is yes. But
Agree.
again, I'd be willing to at least get some vets and see like what that looks like, maybe with a little bit more professionalism. But like you need defense. Like that honestly, like you just didn't have it. And like obviously, like you said, when you're missing so many key pieces, and particularly two guys who are very helpful on the defensive end, that hurts. But
Yeah.
at the same time, if you're relying on those guys to be key pieces of your defense, that's a problem. Like in theory, like, I think if you're going to pay three guys that much money, I think at least two of those three guys got to be, like I think legit two-way players. I think it's kind of hard to have three guys get paid that much and like really only one of them is looked at as a high-level defensive player.
Yeah.
So, that's where, you at least, like you said, got to at least leave it open to the idea of moving on from
And find a head
somebody. But
coach.
oh yeah, that too. I mean, we'll see what they do with uh Isalo. I don't
Yeah.
know what they're gonna do. Maybe he's the long term guy. Maybe he's not. I have literally no clue. My guess is probably not. But then I guess then the other question is who's available? Like, are you getting are you bringing in Michael Malone? Are you bringing in someone else? I guess Budenholzer. Are you bringing in? Are you bring? You're not bringing Taylor Jenkins in again. Taylor Jenkins isn't walking through the door again.
No.
So I don't really know what you really do with that. But that's a question that's gonna be answered probably not too long from now. But
Hmm.
obviously, like it's not like the same situation as Denver where they don't have a true head coach or GM. I know they have Adelman right now, but obviously they're still in the playoffs, so different situation. But
Yes, sir.
I think the Memphis conversation is fascinating just because, again, a couple seasons ago, they were in the same, they felt like they were going to be in the same tier as, like, Oklahoma City,
Hmm.
Cleveland, maybe not Boston, but, like, just as a whole, like, it felt like they were part of, like, that young group.
Yeah,
Like,
they were on the
even a team
rise
like,
for sure.
yeah, even a team like Houston has kind of surpassed
Oh,
them
big
now. And, like,
time.
they don't have, yeah, and they don't have, in my opinion, like, I don't think their best player is like quite as good as Ja. Like
No.
I mean, like I don't think it's I don't think so. But they do have obviously a lot more defensive talent. But that's the funny part because like who would have thought you'd feel better about Houston than Memphis? even though both of them might just go out in the first round and Houston's the higher seed. And again, maybe Houston disappoints next year. Maybe Memphis is better. I don't know. But just as a whole, it again, it's a sign of how fast things can change in the NBA because again, look at, if you look at the standings, look at some of these teams. Like Memphis was a 2 seed a couple seasons ago.
Yep.
They were almost a 60-win team. The Sacramento Kings, they were the 3 seed, right? The Mavs, they were in the finals last year. Like, and then now, or the Suns a few years ago in the finals. And now you look at a lot of these teams, the situations are completely different. And, I don't really know what you really, I don't really know what you do, with
Yep.
the Memphis situation. Like I said, my guess is that they'll probably still end up, like you said, running it back, seeing if the young guys progress, and maybe bringing in some vets. And that maybe that's like the right move to do like next season. But I think you at least gotta kind of like look around and just kind of ask yourself, like, okay, maybe this isn't quite working out.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, now in terms of, comments, right, in regards to, our last couple of videos, we don't actually have any to read this time. But, we did put up a poll from, our last post on IG, and we asked the question, are the Warriors in trouble? This was actually before the Warriors Rockets game 3. And the responses were 100% said no, they're not in trouble. And obviously the Warriors ended up winning game 3. So now, they got 2 more wins left in order to potentially, pull off the upset.
Yeah. I mean, hey, people have a lot of faith in the Warriors, and I think it's it's warranted and definitely has been validated throughout the series so far. When you have a guy like Steph, and his talent and what he's able to bring to a 7 game series. Somebody like myself, I think I thoroughly underestimated that when picking the Rockets in 7. But we'll see how the series goes. But so far, it's not looking good for the Rockets at all. The Warriors definitely have the momentum and are firmly in the driver's seat.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, series isn't over. Usually if you win game 3, you got a really good shot. But of course, first to 4, it's not first to 2, right? So, we'll see what happens going from there.
Yep.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, first round kind of coming to an end. By the time that we have our next episode out, we're probably going to be done with a few more first round matchups. Obviously, if we can, when we have the ability to in terms of our scheduling, we'll try to live stream at the end and at the beginning of some of these series so we can give our takes live and kind of, interact with the chat as we've been doing. And we got some, I think, great results out of that. Obviously, also feel free to leave a comment on our video or any of our shorts, regarding any of the content in the episode that we talked about, obviously, or if you want to join the IG polls, feel free to do so as well. If you leave a comment, we'll read it at the end of the video. And obviously, we always, want you to join those polls. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode.